Hi there. Last time you saw me try the new pontoons on the Lake Uttran. These pontoons. I have these older pontoons as well that I made last year that have a different shape. These have more float, so they can balance high wind speed, but they turn the kayak upwind too much at high wind speed, and at low wind speed this part of the pontoon is only submerged, and as you can see this is does not have a wing profile as this upper part has. So I decided to make these instead, which have a wing profile all the way down to the bottom, meaning that in low wind speed they will still push a kayak upwind a little bit to compensate and work as instead of a centerboard. And at higher wind speed, more of the pontoon will be submerged. And as I saw on my test ride, the power of the wing profile is too high at high wind speed. So I'm thinking about adding material on this outside to actually take away the wing profile of the upper part of the pontoon, and also increase the float of the pontoon at when the wind is pushing the pontoons further down. So that is what I'm going to do. I think I will add some material here and shape it so it blends into the lower part of the pontoon, which is wing profiled. I think that might be what can be done to improve the situation. So let's do that. I measure out how much to add from the middle line to make the pontoon symmetrical. I have some leftover foam from the last build. I measure out how much is needed and add some excess and cut it out. At least 2 centimeters. One third of the pontoons will be covered. To get grip on the glassed surface, I need to sand. The tracks from the sanding will greatly increase the surface area and increase the strength in the bond. I use thickened epoxy as a glue for the bonding and smear it on both bonding sides before putting them together. Clamping is needed to bend the foam over the radius of the pontoon and to close any gaps. The day after, the clamps can be removed, as well as a protective tape around the bolts. Now I want to flatten the surface. I collect the scrap for later use. The end is trimmed thin. I start a slope into the rest of the pontoon, but I will not remove much to keep buoyancy. Cleaning up for the next step. I use a foam dust to make up a filler. Mixing it with thickened epoxy. There are some voids that needs filling. As the foam dust does not bond well, I move over to microballoons. I use this for the rest of the unevenness. The rest of the thickened epoxy is poured over and used on the rest of the surface. I sprinkle the dust over to use as excess filler. An epoxy-strengthened surface is possible to sand with a belt sander. The pure foam will be too soft for the belt sander. It would have disappeared in a second. With this surface I can use the machine to shape the form. I soften the edges for later glassing. Perhaps I should have used a different tool for the transition zone. I need to remove the hardware to prepare the top surface. I also need to cut off the excess around the beam holder. After cutting the sides, I can break off the middle and soften up the edges. I prepare for glassing and cut an opening for the beam holder. But before glassing, I want to flatten the transition zone and other uneven areas. As I use a rather low viscosity mix, I need to level the surface so that the filler doesn't flow away. Higher precision in this step means less sanding later on. To get a smoother and more even surface, I do more sanding. The transition zone requires most work. You can still see blank areas where the sander did not reach. I add the last portion of filler before laying down the cloth. And wetting out the cloth with epoxy. I remove the air bubbles with a roller. Also the top is covered with glass. After several days of curing, the surface can be sanded to get a smooth surface. You can still see some blank low spots that needs filler. And more sanding. With a rather flat surface I can start painting. The first coat goes on without too much fuss. I hang the pontoons to access the other side. It's a bit messy, but it goes with double speed, as I do not have to wait for one side to cure before proceeding. Sanding with 120 grit paper to prepare for the next layer. As I sand outdoors, I limit dust during the painting step. But for the second coat, I still wipe the surface with an alcohol-wetted cloth. As the second coat goes on, you can see some dust from my clothing ending up in the surface. Now I do the different surfaces on different times. The polyurethane coat cures enough within a few hours, so it does not slow me down much. Outdoors again. I have another go with sanding. This will improve the smoothness of the surface, but you can still see some low blank spots. But it starts to look good. For final coat, I carefully vacuum off the dust before moving indoors. For better dust control, I use a sticky cloth and wipe the surface with ethyl acetate. This will remove microdust and any greasy contaminations before putting on the paint. Still a bit uneven, but no dust. When I flip the pontoons, I noticed some droplets along the edge that I cut away before preparing this surface for the paint. Now I just need to add hardware. I drill into the previous holes. Those were strengthened before the test run, so they will hold. Now I'm ready for the next test run. If you want to see how that goes, hit the subscribe button.